All right. So, the beginning of the Cold War certainly happens after World War II, is commonly when we refer to the Cold War. But first, before getting into the factors of the Cold War, first we have to look into the foreign policy of the United States. We'll also look at the Soviet Union, since this is going to essentially cause much of the factors of the Cold War. So, first off, what is foreign policy? Foreign policy essentially is how two countries communicate, negotiate with one another for an overall objective. Now, the overall objective of most countries in the world is to have domination in the world scene. If you have domination in the world scene, then you can survive military, economic, and social clashes much easier than one who does not dominate the world scene. So, United States, Soviet Union, they want to dominate the world scene. Some of the core values of American foreign policy is they believe in natural rights, basically the Bill of Rights. They think everyone should be able to say what they want without being persecuted. They believe everyone should have the right for property, freedom, pursuit of happiness, all that good stuff. They also believe in popular rule, meaning that the government is elected by the actual people instead of being through hereditary, like a king or a small body of rulers where the general population doesn't have any control over. They also believe in free trade, meaning there aren't any tariffs, there isn't any taxes on another country by that said country. So they also believe freedom from old world political and military engagements, and they certainly want to protect United States vital interests. If these beliefs are challenged, certainly there's going to be a conflict of some sort. So keep those in mind when we look into the Cold War and what's going on, whether or not these values are violated. So the United States after World War II. Casualties, we're talking roughly about 420,000 deaths. The United States is unscathed by the war, meaning their cities were not bombed, they were not decimated, their areas were fairly intact. And this generally encouraged the belief that the United States was destined for global dominance. They had suffered the fewer amount of deaths in the war. Their homeland was not touched by war. The economy in the United States was booming, and certainly a lot of the military capabilities of the United States was very good, and they pretty much dominated the economies in the world at this time. Now, going to the Soviet Union, on the other hand, their economy was fairly backward, insecure. It was a very young state. It came into being in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. But they were also very wary of Western powers. So from 1918 to 1920, United States troops secured German war supplies in World War I against the Bolsheviks. And now the Bolsheviks are in power. So certainly there's some distrust between the United States and the Soviet Union based on that. The United States only recognized the Soviet Union as a country in 1933, and that was mainly due to economic concerns on trading with, for example, the Soviet Union to help its own economy. So the belief in American and Soviet relationship being on equal terms certainly is not there. And then World War II casualties for the Soviet Union, as far as deaths, are roughly about 21 to 28 million people. This means soldiers as well as civilians. So there's a massive loss. And that's nothing to say about how much of their cities were destroyed. Stalingrad, Leningrad, all these different cities had been impacted by bombing, being torched, and so on and so forth. So at the paramount of security or the foreign policy of the Soviet Union is going to be its security. They do not want a war like World War II to happen ever again. And so as a result, they're going to make sure that there may be a buffer zone or some sort of security so that the Russian homeland, at least, is not going to be touched by war ever again. Hopefully. That's the aim there. But during World War II, there was a lot of suspicion between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, for example, was very suspicious of what we now know the Manhattan Project that developed the nuclear weapons. They wanted a second front from 1941-42. The United States and Great Britain would not have a second front in at least the form that the Soviets wanted until June 6, 1944. Technically, there is going to be a second front in 1943 in Italy, but it's not the second front that really the Soviets view as being sufficient. As far as the United States is concerned, Pearl Harbor shattered this sense of invulnerability. The United States had not been touched on its home soil, really, in a very long time. We're talking the War of 1812. And so they believed that they were essentially invulnerable in the 1930s and 40s. They were not going to see war touch their shores because they had these two oceans that they might be able to defeat their enemies from. But then Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, shattering that sense of invulnerability. They also recognized that advancing technologies, provided that these oceans were not going to provide them with a sufficient security or defense. They could not rely on the Atlantic or the Pacific to protect them from any sort of bombing or invasion. So this new idea of defense abroad is going to ensure defense at home. If you can stop them in Asia, if you can stop them in Europe before their forces get in range of the United States, then your homeland is safe. So this starts the idea of having bases and being around the world to prevent any sort of forces coming to the home shores of the United States. And you can see this today. Many of these foreign policies and ideas are going to last even to this current day. For example, some of the arguments of politicians today are we are going to be involved in Europe or Asia, the Middle East, to prevent these forces from potentially hurting American soil. At least that's the idea. Now, the United States believes that military dominance is necessary to ensure this whole plan works. So you're going to see a lot of money being tossed into the military machine. Navy, Air Force. Air Force is going to come about in 1947, officially 1948. And so you're going to see a lot of money to enhance the technologies of these forces to do their job to protect the United States homeland, starting from abroad to protect certainly the homeland. I also believe that one country cannot dominate an entire population or economy, and this is something they learned out of World War II. They did not want Germany dominating Europe or Japan dominating Asia, because if they're allowed to dominate those areas, then war might come. So if they can prevent any one country dominating an entire population, or continent for that matter, they're going to do so. So breaking up essentially any sort of power in any of these regions is going to be at the forefront of American ideas. Now, as far as Soviet foreign policy is concerned, much of this I've also hit on previously, but they suffered a lot through World War I and World War II. Their country was in ruins at the end of both of those wars, so security is the number one priority. They believe that a buffer state is necessary. They believe Germany to be the number one threat. And so they argue that Poland is going to be that buffer zone that is needed to prevent Germany from impacting Russia, or the Soviet Union in this case. So they would, if they were to invade Poland, the Soviets are going to have well enough be aware that they're in Poland, and so then they can tackle the Germans or whatever force may be there before they reach Russia. They also want Germany to be weakened completely. They do not want Germany to wage a single war ever again. They want Germany to be completely weak, very much like what it was after World War I. That's due to the sincere hatred of Germany during and after World War II, which, granted, is certainly understandable. And finally, Stalin is just going to be very suspicious of foreign countries, but also Soviet citizens themselves. He just becomes ridiculously paranoid after World War II, as well as during World War II for that matter. All right. So, as far as the end of World War II, this is going to be decided Yalta, 1945. United States and Great Britain support a Soviet-backed Polish government. The reason for this is they understand what the Soviets want. They also understand that the Soviet Union is very powerful, and so it's not something they can really argue with. Soviet Union actually ends World War II being probably one of the most powerful countries in the world. The Soviet Union wants German reparations, so $20 billion is going to be the reparations, and half of that is going to be going to the Soviet Union. In exchange of those agreements, basically a Soviet-backed Polish government, and half of the reparations going to the Soviet Union, the Soviets agreed to declare war on Japan. At this time of this conference, this is very early 1945, they knew Germany was going to fall, but they weren't sure the course of Japan. They believed that they could defeat Japan, certainly, but as far as what direction it would go in, they believed that they would have to do a land invasion of Japan. So having some Soviets involved would be nice. So they agreed that there would be free and democratic elections in Eastern Europe. Roosevelt wanted a democracy for free and open markets in Europe. Churchill did as well. And they didn't trust that Stalin was going to have his hands off in Eastern Europe. And they believed that he would make pro-Soviet states and basically manipulate the democratic rule in Eastern Europe. And they're right, he is going to manipulate the elections when it comes time to that. But on April 13th, 1945, we're going to have President Truman be the new president in the United States due to Franklin Roosevelt passing. At this time, Europe is in complete ruins. They're only about a month away from Germany's official surrender, but everyone knows it's going to happen at any day. Europe lacked agricultural goods. They lack homes, since most of these cities have been destroyed by American and British bombers. Much of the farmland had been destroyed by bombs as well, or it had been mined, or there's some shrapnel or some other problems with the agriculture itself. There just really wasn't a good way to make good farmland, especially the amount of crops needed to feed all the people. There's also going to be thousands upon thousands of displaced persons after this war, either by people having their homes destroyed, not really having a home, but also you're going to have many of these concentration camps throughout Europe being freed. And so as a result, you're going to have Jews, you're going to have gypsies, you're going to have political prisoners are now just let out of the gates of the concentration camps, and they really don't have a home to go to in the first place. So they're really just going to try to find shelter and food, much like any person would do. So you have a lot of these displaced persons all throughout Europe. And Europe doesn't have any money. They had the Lend-Lease program going through. So the Americans were supplying the Soviets, the British, with weapons, and they were going to pay for them after the war. But France have been completely decimated by the war with Germany and then with the bombings um, taking place by American and British fighters and bombers. They really didn't have an economy in place. Germany didn't really have an economy in place. Britain, it did have an economy. Much of its territory was bombed, but it was certainly in a better position than France. Um, but they really bankrupt themselves after World War I, and World War II does not help by any means. Uh, as a result, Churchill, as well as Truman, are convinced that Germany needs to be rebuilt. It needs to be an economic power. It always has been a very big economic power in Europe, and so that's going to be required to help Europe rebuild, but also in their mind to combat maybe Soviet pressure in Europe. Of course, that is a clash with the Soviet Union. All right. So already we're starting to see that the Soviets and the West are not getting along. Their ideologies and foreign policy are not in sync, and so that doesn't help the situation. But what Stalin does after World War II is now he has essential control over Eastern Europe. And so what he does is he goes through Eastern Europe and he starts filling Soviet labor camps in Siberia, for example, with non-communists. Any sort of political figure, anyone who might be popular who is not communist, is going to see themselves sent to these labor camps. This is also going to include POWs from Germany. So a lot of populations are going to be rounded up and sent to Siberia, and many of them are going to perish. The Soviets also move factories from Germany. They pick them up, dismantle them, and move them to Russia. They want to remove any sort of industrial capacity from Germany. The idea is that it'll make it weaker. And so you literally have factories moving from one part to another. So essentially Germany, Eastern Germany, is going to starve. They don't have an economy to make money, to buy food. So Eastern Europe is really in a bad spot. And certainly Churchill and Truman see this going on. And they're very fearful of what's going to happen. So they're even more encouraged to make Western Europe, if they can, Eastern Europe strong, but they know they have control over Western Europe. In February 1947, the British announced they cannot fund the fight against communism in Greece. This is when one area where elections were taking place. And the Americans and the British were going in, spreading propaganda. They were spreading ideas, paying debts, anything they could do to make countries or areas disdain the communists and maybe go to the more democratic rule, or at least be more favorable to the British or the Americans. Now, the British are going to announce that they cannot fund the efforts to combat communism in Greece. So Truman is now up against the wall, and he is basically faced to take over the role of the British Empire. The British Empire had ruled certainly from the 1700s now to the end of World War II, and now the United States is going to take on that role. What we have is what we now call the Truman Doctrine. What this doctrine is containment. Basically put a stop to the spread of communism by containing it. You're not going to completely remove communism from other countries, but you're just going to make sure it doesn't spread. This doctrine is going to survive for the remainder of the Cold War. We call it a Truman Doctrine, but for example, you're going to have Eisenhower is going to use the same type of policy. You're going to see Nixon, Kennedy, Ford, many different presidents are going to use the same type of mentality. They're pretty much going to accept it and continue it from 1947 all the way until about 1989, 1991, depending on how you really define the end of the Cold War. One of the programs that is going to be used to help is what we call the Marshall Plan. This is the U.S. effort to rebuild Europe. What it does is $17 billion are going to be loaned to Europe. It is going to be offered to every single European country. So it will be offered to Britain, France, Germany, Spain, any neutral powers, any powers that might be in Eastern Europe as well. And Stalin is going to refuse this aid. He believes it is a plan for American domination in Europe. And he's right. To put it bluntly, it is. They want to convince people that communism is bad, and as a result, to go to American democracy ideas, here's some money, throw money at the problem. And this works. But Stalin is going to make all of the Eastern European powers or countries refuse this money. Czechoslovakia doesn't get the message, and they do accept this aid. But in February of 1948, soon after they accepted the aid, there's a mysterious coup that occurs, and the communists take over in Czechoslovakia. But many people can see the writing on the wall. From 1948 to 1953, Stalin's going to go throughout Eastern Europe. After Czechoslovakia accepts this aid, he is going to execute communist leaders who he thinks might threaten his power. He views that there was a denial of his power in Czechoslovakia, so he wants to make sure that never happens again. So a lot of powerful communists and important leaders in Eastern Europe are going to find themselves executed after this phase. So as far as the Marshall Plan, it is going to affect much of Western Europe. So you're going to have Ireland, England, France, Portugal, Switzerland, Italy, Hungary, Norway, Sweden. All of these areas are going to accept the $17 billion. And what it does is now these countries can afford to buy building materials, brick, they can buy concrete, wood, any sort of housing supplies, since they're going to rebuild a lot of homes, going to rebuild the roads, railroads, all throughout Europe. But where are they going to get this money? Or where are they going to get the supplies, rather? They're going to get this money, obviously, from the United States. But they're going to buy these products, steel, wood, and many other different building materials from the United States as well. So this is never also to rebuild the American economy. Now, the economy was doing fairly well towards the end of World War II, but to ensure that it doesn't collapse into another depression of sorts when all these soldiers come back, any way to ensure that the economy is on its feet and supply jobs, this is another way to do it. This was one of the plans considered after World War II, and it works. These countries cannot build, they don't have steel-making plants in place. They had either been taken away from by the Soviets, or they've been completely destroyed by bombing from the Americans and the British. So everyone's going to come to the United States and buy steel and other building materials, as well as any other supplies anyone might need, paper, for example. And so this revitalizes the American economy. So if you wonder why the economy is booming in the 1950s, here's why. We're rebuilding Europe. Everyone's coming to buy it. Now we're using our own money, certainly to get them started, but it's going to continue from this point to this current day as well. A lot of Europeans buy a lot of American goods. This starts here. So the Marshall Plan is very, very successful across the board. But it's also, the Marshall Plan is going to certainly start the beginning of what we would consider the Cold War. But the next phase of the Cold War is going to be with Berlin. Now, Berlin was separated into 4 different sections. Half of Berlin is going to be given to the Soviets to control, and then the other half of Berlin is going to be separated between the United States, Britain, and France. But also, Germany is going to be cut in half. The eastern half is going to be given to the Soviets, and the western half is going to be divided up between the US, Britain, and France. Now, Berlin is the capital, and to get to the western portion of Berlin, the easiest way is going to be through planes. But you basically are at the jurisdiction of the Soviets to get there by land. And to basically restrict and Berlin, what Stalin does is he starts a blockade of Berlin. He doesn't let any American, French, or British forces come in, whether it be civilians or military forces, by land at all. He completely blockades it. The reason he's doing this is also due to his paranoia. He's trying to regain control and make sure the Germans reject the Americans, British, and French, the West. He also hopes to garner some more reparations from Western Germany. So he's actually seeking a bribe of sorts. If you open up the border just to basically Eastern Germany, we'll give you some money. That's what he's hoping to do. It doesn't work that way. Basically, there is an airport on the western section of Berlin. The United States and British use their planes. They've previously used some of these planes for bombers. Now they're going to be retrofitted as transport aircraft. They put in 12,000 tons of food a year. Or actually each day, 12,000 tons of food. They do that for a year, sorry. So they continue doing this every day, around the clock. They're delivering these supplies left and right, 12,000 tons of food per day, and they do this for a year. By May 1949, this blockade ends. He gives it up, but he does build a wall through basically Berlin. This is that wall that separates Berlin, and it starts in 1949, and it's going to divide Berlin all the way till 1989 when it finally falls, which the anniversary was just a few months ago. After this instance, the West decides a military alliance is going to be needed to defeat the Soviet Union if it plans to invade Europe. And this was a concern of the Europeans for much of this time. And so the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is going to begin. It is a military alliance. The British, the French, the Americans, and much of Western Europe is going to be involved in this alliance. It still lasts to this day. So if there's an attack on one, there's an attack on all of them. Now on August 29th, 1949, the Soviets successfully develop a nuclear bomb, and they detonate it, and they continue to detonate this bomb in many, many different tests. So the monopoly the United States has on a nuclear weapon no longer is there anymore. Previously, Truman could say, we have a nuclear bomb, if you don't do what we say, we'll nuke you. And that worked for a time, but now the Soviets can do the same thing. And so this threat of nuclear war and certainly the end of human civilization starts from 1949 onward. And they're also going to have a Soviet military alliance. There's going to be an alliance system between Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. But many of these countries in Eastern Europe are forced to join this Soviet military alliance. So that is essentially the beginning of how the Cold War starts. Certainly a lot of things going on, a lot of power play between the United States and the Soviet Union. They are the two major players. The Europeans at this point have lost their dominance in the world scene, and now is left up to the United States and the Soviet Union to decide the fate of the world with nuclear weapons.